In this module, we shall discuss about choice of techniques and appropriate technology and employment. Underdeveloped countries are characterized by lack of decent standard of living or absence of mechanized techniques. In order to achieve planned economic development, investment planning is required and choice of technique is related with investment planning. There are large number of alternate techniques of production, each having different capital investment and production cost. A superior technique among various alternate techniques is one which has least cost of production among them. For the purpose of analysis, labor and capital are assumed to be substitute to one another and are relevant factors of production, although other factors like different levels of entrepreneurial skills or managerial talent may also be relevant. Similarly, there are differences in labor and capital, but both are assumed to be homogeneous. In case of labor, there are differences in efficiency, level of knowledge, training and skills, climatic impact on productivity, etc. Hence, labor is in fact a heterogeneous factor and not homogeneous as assumed to be. Similarly, there are differences in availability of capital, terms of capital in respect of interest rates, duration of capital and efficiency, etc. However, capital is assumed to be a homogeneous factor. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the labor and capital intensive techniques, know about the different techniques of production. First, we shall discuss about labor and capital intensive techniques. There are labor intensive techniques and capital intensive techniques. In labor intensive techniques, more of labor and less of capital, plant and machinery is used. In capital intensive techniques, more of capital, that is modern plants and machines, is used and less of labor. Degree of capital intensive technique depends on the ratio of labor to capital. Less developed countries are labor surplus countries and they are capital deficient, leaving apart differences in their economic, social, cultural, technical and entrepreneurial skills. Labor intensive techniques would be an appropriate in less developed countries as labor being abundant is cheap and capital being deficient is costly. Moving on to the choice of technique of production. Choice of technique for less developed and developed countries is the choice of most efficient technique among various alternative techniques which cannot be other than least cost technique. There are large number of techniques of production starting from primitive technique of handmade production to fully automatic production techniques. In highly developed countries, factory operations are wholly mechanized, requiring a few laborers, say 2 to 5. However, capital investment differs from technique to technique. Francis Stewart defines capital intensive technique as capital per worker or K divided by C ratio. He says capital and labor intensity can be defined also as capital and labor per unit of output. He contended that both definitions will rank the techniques in the same order if only efficient techniques are considered. Inferior techniques are those techniques which produce same output as some other techniques of production using more of one factor at least and no less of the other factor. Different techniques of production are generally employed consistent with different strategies of economic development with very different effect on performance of the economy. Professor A.K. Sen worked on the choice of techniques also resolves various contradictions between suggested criteria. He finds contradiction in Professor Nurkse's work on disguised unemployment, where Professor Nurkse says that marginal productivity of labor is zero over wide range of labor. Professor Sen asks, why is labor applied at all if marginal productivity is zero over wide range of labor? He says it is against rational behavior. Professor Sen points out that contradiction arose because of not distinguishing between labor and laborer, which he ratified in his analysis of choice of techniques. Both capital intensive techniques as well as labor intensive technique can achieve the same output if it is assumed that isoquant, which is the equal product curve, are convex to the origin. Cobb-Douglas production function indicating constant returns to scale is assumed in the analysis of the isoquant curve. Full employment can be achieved with various degrees of capital intensity, that is, various amounts of capital per unit of labor, as is evident from the diagram, which is labeled diagram. Here E is the efficient scale of operation relevant to the developed countries who have scarcity of labor but plenty of capital. At E, OB of capital and OE1 of labor is used in diagram, where it is shown that developed and developing countries can have a technique for the same output on an isoquant, that is equal product curve. At F, technique OC of labor and OF1 of capital is used relevant to less developed countries. It will pay to less developed countries to adopt F technique, which is cost effective because it uses more labor and less capital. Developed countries having more capital but deficient labor may develop a superior technique where same amount of labor but more amount of capital is combined, leading to proportionately higher output from isoquant Q1 to isoquant Q2, as is evident from diagram. ON is labor and OD is capital, and technique is at A at Q1 isoquant, improved technique B at Q2 isoquant, where ON labor and OC capital is required to produce higher output at Q2 isoquant, that is, higher input of capital but same input of labor leads to higher output, which is indicated in figure. An efficient superior technique can result in much higher output accompanied by reduction in capital and more labor employment, as is evident from diagram where P is on isoquant Q1 and P2 involving less capital and more labor is on isoquant Q2, which shows that P2 is more efficient and cost effective technique compared to P1, resulting in much higher output and lesser amount of cost, which is relevant to less developed countries like India, which is also now indicated in figure. As new cost effective techniques are discovered, existing techniques which were either too efficient techniques become inefficient techniques. This is both in respect of developed and less developed countries. Let us take the case of less developed countries and show how existing techniques of production, which were hitherto efficient techniques, become inefficient techniques. As is clear from diagram, at E production technique, OK amount of capital and OL amount of labor is used to produce a given output. A superior technique E1 is developed where more of labor OL1, same amount of capital OK is used, which is essentially cost minimizing technique compared to E technique. Yet another E2 technique superior to both E1 and E is developed, which is much more superior and relevant to underdeveloped countries because it involves more labor OL2 and less capital OT. E1E becomes both inferior, outdated techniques as E2 is developed. So this is indicated in figure. In underdeveloped countries like India, there are entrepreneurs adopting capital intensive techniques of developed countries to maximize their profitability using more of capital, that is plant and machinery, less of labor, having no regard for labor surpluses or redundant labor in these countries. It is also possible that in the process of development of new efficient, cost-effective techniques of production, superior techniques are discovered leading to less of capital and less of labor input, which has been done in developed countries where mechanized techniques of production are more advanced and commonly used, as is evident from diagram where A is prevalent technique of production. After A, C technique is developed, which reduces labor input from OL1 to OL2. Capital remains the same at OK1. Technique B uses less of labor, OL3, more of capital, OD, which is the most cost effective technique of production from developed countries' point of view. At E, production technique labor cost is reduced from OL1 to OL4 and capital cost is also reduced from OD to K2. So, E techniques becomes the most efficient technique compared to A, B, C and R, which may be found in developed countries where mechanization is the order of the day. So, this is given in figure. There are cases where labor intensive technique of production in some industries can coexist with capital intensive techniques of production. Choice of technique in footwear manufacturing is the case relevant for this purpose. In countries with high wage rate, machine intensive techniques, which are highly capital intensive, are more profitable than labor intensive technique. It was found that in low wage countries, there is no difference in the profitability between different projects employing mixes of capital, which is machines, and labor intensive manufacturing techniques. Profitability is affected especially by the type of footwear chosen for production and quality of management in less developed countries than the differences in manufacturing technology. Most type of footwear, it should be noted, is labor intensive, even when most machine intensive manufacturing techniques are available. Low wages in developing countries footwear industry more than offsets higher level of productivity found in developed countries enterprises. There is another case of industry where labor intensive techniques of production coexist with capital intensive techniques of production, which is the case of iron foundry, in which small scale enterprises have managed to coexist with size of plants. Small scale enterprises which are labor intensive industry can coexist with large scale enterprises as far as iron founding is concerned, although scale economics are availed by large plants which produce on a large scale. Captive iron foundry is more common in less developed countries than developed countries because lesser degree of division of labor. The market for particular type of casting is limited and hence division of labor is much smaller. Level of technology is also lower than otherwise the case would be. Hand molding can be compared with mechanized molding. Because of low labor cost, hand molding is quite viable and coexists with mechanized molding. Moving on to the techniques of production in underdeveloped countries. The cost of total output by the capital intensive technique would be less than by the labor intensive. What happens to the total volume of employment in the long run depends upon whether this producer's surplus is spent, reinvested or hoarded. If this surplus and similar surpluses that accrue subsequently are reinvested in capital intensive techniques, total employment would be in the long run larger. In fact, the chain of reinvestment would constitute an investment multiplier based upon successive saving of cost rather than on successive additions to income. The preceding thesis has been stated rather tersely in order to bring out its central point, which is that the volume of employment depends on the size of the national output and the use to which it is put, rather than directly on the technique used to produce that output. The statement, however, smooths over several difficulties which are important in the real world. In the first place, capital goods which embody higher techniques have a longer period of gestation. This is disadvantageous for two reasons. There is first the loss of output that can be obtained in the shorter period by the adoption of labor intensive methods. Secondly, if total income rises early, investment for further expansion can begin early too. But the first loss is not likely to be large, even in underdeveloped countries, except in circumstances of grave shortage of some basic commodity. And the second is more than made up by the higher productivity of the capital intensive technique in the long run. A more widespread criticism has its source in what we may call the theory of balanced growth by small stages for underdeveloped countries. To put it very briefly, it is argued that production is a matter not merely of technology but also a market. And since different goods and services provide markets for one another, an extended output of one commodity or some commodities should be matched by expanded production of others. But, and here is the crux of the argument, total saving in an underdeveloped country is never large enough for all round use of capital intensive techniques, while to adopt these in some avenues of production only may upset the economic balance and retard total development. Hence, the right policy for an underdeveloped country is to use labor intensive methods as much as possible, each industry employing as little capital as the total capital supply permits. The criticism and the theory from which it is derived are, however, based on a confused conception of economic balance and of the process of economic growth. In the first place, a single industry can adopt superior technique and expand its output and sale without other industries expanding simultaneously, so long as the price of its product does not fall more than the cost of production. The total output of the economy and the real incomes of all sectors can rise and a new balance be established through new price relationships. Moreover, there is no reason to think that the rise of real income achieved in this manner will not be greater if the same investment was spread over a large number of new industries, each of which is used inferior labor intensive techniques. Let us summarize what we have learned in this model. Underdeveloped countries are characterized by lack of decent standard of living or absence of mechanized techniques. In order to achieve planned economic development, investment planning is required and choice of technique is related with investment planning. There are large number of alternate techniques of production, each having different capital investment and production cost. There are labor intensive techniques and capital intensive techniques. In labor intensive techniques, more of labor and less of capital, that is plant and machinery is used. In capital intensive techniques, more of capital, that is modern plants and machine is used and less of labor. Degree of capital intensive technique depends on the ratio of labor to capital. Choice of technique for less developed and developed countries is the choice of most efficient technique among various alternative techniques which cannot be other than the least cost technique.